In this video, I'm going to go through the steps of rendering your final file once you've got your render layers and all those things set up and ready to go. I'm going to go through a few things that you might want to consider when setting up a render in general. So first of all, you want to make sure that in your render setup window, all the layers that you want to include and want to render have the render option checked, which is this box here. So you can see currently all mine are checked. The master layer, which is the top one, we actually don't need it for the purposes of our assignment. So if you want to, you can uncheck it and it will not render. There's no harm in having it. It's not going to hurt anything. And sometimes you can use it as a reference. So if you want to include it, that's fine. But it is not required in Nuke for compositing. So I'm going to turn that off. And then I'm going to make sure all these are turned on. Now, another great function or use of these is making changes. If you submit your assignments or submit work and there's feedback, and the feedback pertains to just one of these layers, say the shadow only. Maybe the shadow needs to be darker. Maybe the type of shadow needs to change, or maybe the size of the shadow needs to change, whatever the case may be. If the only thing that's been updated is shadow only, when you make the changes, depending on what's changed, you might be able to get away with just rendering that single layer over again. And in that case, you would just uncheck everything and then just make sure that the only thing activated is shadow only. And then it will not re-render any of the other layers. So again, this button here allows you to define what things and what layers are rendering when you hit the render button. If you're not using layers, if it's just a straight render, then you don't need to worry about this at all. Just keep the master turned on and it's going to render that by default. When you're working with the render setup, it's very important to pay attention to what's happening here. So again, I'm going to uncheck the master. And that's it for the render setup options. Now I'm going to go into my render dialog box, render settings dialog, which is this button right here, the film clapper with the gear next to it. So the things you want to look at here, you want to make sure that the image format is set correctly. Should be set to EXR. You want to make sure that the frame/animation extension are set properly. For this assignment specifically, we're only rendering a single frame. So this is fine. The default is fine. So it's going to give it a name .extension. And the extension is whatever format you're chosen. So it'll be, the name is derived from the file name itself by default, and the extension is derived from whatever file format you've got chosen. If you're going to render a sequence, which eventually we will be, then I prefer, there's a number of options here for sequence as far as naming goes. They all work. It's a preference or a pipeline thing. Really, it could be defined by the pipeline. But for me personally, I prefer name underscore number dot extension. So it's file name underscore frame number dot extension. If you choose anything other than one of the single frame options, then it will unlock the frame and sequence settings here. So frame padding is currently set to 4. Frame padding is pretty much the number of digits in the frame number. So if it's set to 4 and you've got frame 1, the frame numbering will be frame 0001, 4 digits. So that's what the padding refers to. If it was 3, then your frame padding would give you 001, and then 002, 003, so on and so forth. So the number of digits you want to represent the frame number is what the padding refers to. How should you set this? As a rule of thumb, you should set it to match the number of frames that you have. So if your total frame output is going to be 400 frames, anything in the hundreds, that will be 3 digits. So you should set your frame padding to at least 3. If you've got over 1,000 frames, if you've got somewhere between 1,000 and 9,999 frames, that's 4 digits. You should set your padding to at least 4. If you're getting into tens of thousands, it should be 5. If it's only 10, 2 digits, you would set your frame padding to at least 2. You never want your padding to be less than the number of digits in the total number of frames that you have. So if you do, it could cause alphabetization issues with certain softwares. So as a rule of thumb, just determine how many digits are going to be in the total number of frames rendered and at least equal that with your padding. We don't have to worry about that in this file because we're only rendering a single frame, and frame padding is not going to be used. Before we move on, I also want to touch on the frame range option. So the frame range defines the range of frames that you want to actually output. So right now the default is set from 1 to 10, so it's going to render out 10 frames. Again, normally you would set this to the length of your timeline, or depending on how you've got your timeline set up, the length of your active animation. This is another way to kind of figure out what your padding should be. So for example, if I had to render out 495 frames, I would go from frame 1 to 495 to render all of them. And then I just got to say, I've got 3 digits here. So that's what my frame padding should be. If I had to render out 1,500 frames, so from frame 1 to 1,500, then my frame padding would be 1, 2, 3, 4 digits. Simple as that. I'm going to disable that because for this specific example, I'm only going to render out a single frame. So where it says frame animation extension, I'm going to set that back to name.extension single frame, and then all this gets grayed out. The other thing you should triple check here just to make sure is also in the common tab, make sure that you're rendering the correct camera. I'm going to choose render cam. Also check your resolution. There's a preset here for our purposes. I'm fine with you rendering pretty much any of the files. If I don't specify in Blackboard, either HD 720 or HD 1080 will be accepted. But always check Blackboard, because if I want a specific resolution, it will be stated there. If it doesn't say, you can use either of these presets. If I do ask for a specific res, it'll usually be HD 1080. So if you want to be safe, 1080 is the kind of safest choice. The reason why you might want to render 720, and I'm pretty much going to be accepting all of next semester's assignments in 720, is because I know everybody's rendering at home and everybody has different level of computer power as far as what machine you're working with. And HD 720 is still a nice clear image, but it's 4 times less pixels than 1080, which means it will render 4 times faster. And I know how long rendering can take. So for the purposes of any assignment for me that requires animation, I'm okay with 720. If it's a single frame, as this assignment is, I'm pretty much going to ask for 1080 because I know 1 frame is not too much to ask at that resolution. That is pretty much it. One thing I will touch on as well before we go to the actual menu is the Arnold settings. So if we go to the Arnold renderer, if you want to adjust the quality of your render, you would do it here. I'm not going to go too much in depth as to what these do. If you go into the help documentation, it's all listed out there very clearly in the Arnold documentation what this stuff all controls. But just to kind of give you a simple Coles Notes version of how to adjust these, the camera AA value is all these set the number of samples, and samples pretty much are how many times the renderer kind of scans and calculates a specific shadow reflection The more samples it has, the more calculations it does to make it cleaner and clearer and less pixelated, so on and so forth. So obviously higher samples equals higher quality, but that also equals higher render time. So your goal is to try to optimize the settings so that you've got the maximum quality with the minimum amount of time, and balance. It's a balancing act. You're trying to kind of get a balance of speed and quality always. You don't just want to crank these values to ridiculously high numbers, because it can make the difference between minutes to hours per frame. As a rule of thumb, what you want to do is set the camera AA down low for testing. So while you're setting up your file and you just want to work quickly and do test renders, set that down to 2 or 3. And you can see the sample numbers here dramatically drop. So the cool thing about Arnold is it gives you this feedback, so you can see the number of samples and how this value affects it. And what you will notice is that the camera AA setting is a multiplier. It affects all of the settings here globally. So if I adjust camera AA, I'm adjusting all of these settings based on the value they currently have. 0 is obviously disabled. 3 and 2 are, again, right now diffuse has more samples than specular, which means diffuse is going to have to work a little bit harder. And what this value does is it multiplies these values. So you can see if I boost my camera AA, the number of samples here will go up for everything. So you can see they all just got higher. If I adjust it here, so if I make diffuse 6 instead of 3, watch the values up here. Only diffuse bumped up. So these individual sliders allow you to balance out the quality on just these settings individually. And then the camera AA is an overall that is a multiplier based on the starting values of the other sliders. So as a rule of thumb, 3 and 2 are probably a good starting point for the diffuse and specular. And then, like I said, while you're testing, a value of 2 to 4 for the camera AA is a good point to get you a quick, but it'll be a lesser quality render. But to get the idea of balancing lighting and shadow directions, you don't need high quality to see if things are going in the right direction. For a final render, I would generally boost this up to between 6 and 8. I usually use 8, but again, depending on your computer and the resolution, you may want to test that out. But 8 will generally give you a good production quality render with these base settings. Now within that, if you find that when you boost your overall quality to 6 or 8 and there's still a little bit of grain in the shadows or in the reflections or in the transparencies or so on and so forth, then you would tweak these individually to kind of tune that area. So if you have grain in the general lighting and the shadows, then you would bump up the diffuse. If you feel like the specular highlights or the reflections are rough and jagged and too pixelated, then you would boost the specular. If you've got glass and materials that introduce transmission values, so anything see-through, if you feel like the see-through effects are grainy and not as clear as they could be, you would boost transmission, so on and so forth. So in our renders, most of you guys are going to have to worry about diffuse and specular for this assignment. So just keep that in mind. Camera is an overall adjustment, and the individual sliders allow you to tweak individual values within that. And that is pretty much it for the basic render settings. So I'm going to close that, and then we're going to go to our actual rendering menu. So for rendering with Arnold, we're going to go into the rendering submenu in the drop down here. We're going to go to our render dialog box or render menu. And for this free version of Maya and Arnold, the only option we've got really is to render sequence. If you have the pay version of Maya and Arnold, if you're a paying customer, then you can also use batch render, which allows you to use network rendering. You cannot do that for free. So we're forced to use render sequence, which is fine. It'll do the trick for our purposes. So I'm going to go to the render sequence options. And then you can see here, you can actually choose independently the render cam. So again, triple check to make sure the correct camera is selected here. And then the only other option you have to worry about here is this one, all render enabled layers. If I open up my render setup menu again, this checkbox is what tells Arnold to obey these. This isn't anything with a blue box here is a render enabled layer. If you don't check that, it will render everything regardless of what you've got set up here. So you could have all these tweaked, it'll still render everything. So we want to make sure that this first checkbox is checked so that it obeys the settings here. Other than that, we don't have to check a thing. The second option you may check depending on how you've got your file set up. If you've got more than one render camera set up, maybe if you've got two different angles, you want to do a cut of some sort in your camera when you're editing later, then you would render all render enabled cameras. This would allow you to render any camera that you've set up in the render settings as renderable. Again, for this assignment, not necessary. Now, a big mistake people often make here is this. They fill out this. You don't want to do that. It says alternate output file location. Alternate. We don't need an alternate. We've already set the file output location in the main render settings. Do not put anything in here. Most people do. It's not required for our output. So please, please, please leave that blank. Obviously I'm making such a point of that because it is a common mistake. So the only things are render camera, current camera set to the render cam, all render enabled layers checked, and then that is it. We just click render sequence and close, and it will render based on the settings we set here earlier. And that includes a sequence. If you had set up a sequence, it will automatically render the sequence. And that is pretty much all there is to it. Once you're done rendering, the renders should, if you've set up your project correctly, your renders should all be living inside the images folder. That's where you would check for them. Once the render is done, that's where the renders will be. Another issue that, or another common mistake people make, I'll just point this out before I stop the video. You guys are used to doing your test renders from here, which is perfectly fine. This is not where you render, though. This is not where you save your render. So again, a lot of people go here, File, Save Image. That is not correct. You will not get your render layers or anything like that if you render it this way. This is just for preview rendering while you're working on the project. When you're ready for final output, you save your file as it is in the final form, and then you do everything we just went through and make sure you're rendering through the render sequence menu option. That is where final renders should be produced. Okay, that is pretty much it for this video. I hope it helps you complete your rendering for this and future rendering needs. And yeah, happy rendering.